not an indicator of bipedalism in hominins. Who put broad, short, bowl-shaped pelvis? Who put significantly increased cranial capacity? Yes, right? Because significantly increased cranial capacity is not necessary for bipedalism. Not necessary for bipedalism. It comes much later in the evolutionary history. Whereas that short, broad, bowl-shaped pelvis, valgus angle at the knee, foramen magnum at the base of the cranium, and a medially angled femur are all traits that are seen in bipedalism, are necessary for efficient bipedalism. Right? Brain size comes much later. All right. Any questions? No? So here we're going to talk about the earliest hominins and the early Australopithecines, right? And the reason why we distinguish these two, or I distinguish these two, your book tends to distinguish these two, is because we have some very early hominin finds, fossils, that have attributes, skeletal attributes that make them likely hominins, right? They're using bipedal locomotion. Not all of these are going to be ancestral to us, anatomically modern humans. And what we're going to see is that from that last common ancestor that we shared with chimps and bonobos, there's likely what I would call a really fluffy bush that evolves over time. There are a number of different species of bipedal hominins that evolve, adapt, and many of them go extinct over the 7 million years of human evolutionary history. So it's not a straight unilineal, one species gives rise to another, gives rise to another. Right? So what we see instead is more like an adaptive radiation. Not nearly as intense as what you see with the lemurs in Madagascar or the finches in the Galapagos, but it's the same sort of idea where we have a very, very vibrant bush of evolution, right, coming forward. And a lot of species are essentially sort of evolutionary experiments. And they go extinct. But we need to look at several of these, and I'm trying to make it as straightforward as possible for you because there are a lot of species, there are a lot of genera, plural for genus, a lot of funky names because of the scientific naming system of genus and species. And so I'll try to make things make sense for you, try to help you put it together. But we're going to look sort of like at this through time, and then look at geography and morphology and some adaptations, right? So what does the morphology mean about the behavior, those adaptations that are going on? Now, the next slide has a lot of big words on it, and it's got dates. I am not particularly concerned with you memorizing all these specific dates. The idea is that you have an idea of the general time frames. Okay? They have 4 species here. These are the 4 earliest hominin species that are currently accepted. We have Sahelanthropus chidensis from 7 to 6 million years ago from what is now the country of Chad, so in Central Africa. So we have, names, dates, and locations. For your purposes, in most cases, geography, you need that general. Central Africa, East Africa, South Africa. Those are a lot of the locations we're going to visit here in the next couple lectures. Okay? And then also the idea that Sahelanthropus chidensis, 7 to 6 million years ago, is the earliest of the early hominins. It is the first species, the first fossil species for which we have evidence of bipedal behavior. Right? Then we have Aurorantugenensis from about 6 million years ago, from a site in East Africa. We have Ardipithecus cadaba, 5.8 to 5.6 million years ago in East Africa, and Ardipithecus ramidus, about 4.4 million years ago from East Africa. Right. Now, for our purposes, we're going to talk about Sahelanthropus chidensis and Aurorantugenensis, and then again, we're going to talk about Ardipithecus ramidus. Cadaba is interesting, but trying to kind of hit the high points here as we do this. So, and then we're going to move on to those early Australopithecines, where with the early Australopithecines, it's not, they got bipedal behavior, but there's some other things about them that are not consistent with an overall obligatory bipedal pattern, whereas these early Australopithecines, which obviously come later than Ardipithecus ramidus, they show evidence of the full suite of bipedal locomotion adaptations. So that's where we get a separation. So let me take it back to about 7 million years ago. And we're going to look at fossils from sites in Africa. Africa is often called the cradle of humanity. It is the origin of humanity. This is where we get the first hominin fossil, and this is where the vast majority of human evolution takes place up until about 200,000 years ago. Right? So Africa as a continent, particularly East Africa and South Africa, is a locus for human evolution. The vast majority of human evolution has taken place in the continent of Africa. There are probably sites in areas besides East Africa and South Africa, but because of the geology of East Africa and South Africa, that is where we get the most fossils. That's where we get the most fossils. East Africa, you can see circled here with the blue ring. That is the African Rift Valley. The African Rift Valley. There are 2 plates there. There's the really big continental African plate, and it is moving westward right along that rift. And then there's the Somalian plate, which is like a microplate, and it is moving east. And then just above it, where you have the Arabian Peninsula, you have the Arabian plate, and it's moving north. So you've got a big spreading zone right through here, right down through here. So what happens when you have a spreading zone, continental plates, is that you get a lot of tectonic activity, aka volcanoes. You have the lava welling up through the crust in this spreading zone, right? And so it's actually fairly complex. You get spreading zones here and here and here and here, all through here. It's If you look it up, it's rather fascinating. But anyway, this gives us an area right through here that is currently fairly dry, and there's a long record, millions and millions and millions of years of volcanic activity in this area. And volcanic activity is good for, as it happens, preserving fossils, but it's also good for what? What can you do with volcanic ash, volcanic tuff, volcanic layers in a stratigraphy? It freezes everything in time, right? You get nice, it tends to be pretty stable over time as well because it hardens to a very dense, not really dense, but a very hard sediment layer. Dating, right? Potassium, argon dating, argon-argon ratio. It is excellent for dating. So not only is this an area that now is dry, right? So we have sediments eroding, which exposes fossils, but we also have volcanic material for dating purposes. So it's just sort of a confluence of factors. It's an excellent place to hunt for fossils. You move further east, notice that the map looks awfully green. And what does green mean? Vegetation, right? Grasslands, forest lands, tropical jungle. The more carbon material there is in an environment, so the more vegetatively dense an area is, the less likely you are to get fossils from that area. Simply because there's so much vegetative material that things decompose fairly quickly. So we don't tend to find a lot of fossils in areas where it's lush rainforest to forested areas. You need those drier zones. And this is one of the reasons why it was often thought that early human evolution was driven by walking out onto the savanna and adapting to life on the savannas because it was found in these sorts of environments. That's more of a fluke, spurious result of the way fossilization occurs. So so the sites in South Africa are mostly cave sites. And we talked about how caves can also be good for fossil production, the making of fossils. So the very first, this earliest fossil that has evidence for bipedalism comes from this site in what's now the country of Chad. Actually a fairly dry area now. However, at the time that this fossil lived, the species lived represented by the fossil, Sahelanthropus chadensis, and the fact that Chad is in the species name chadensis is a clue that it comes from Chad, which is in Central Africa. So today this is a fairly dry area that's not super lush. However, 7 million years ago, which is what this fossil dates to, it would have been a much denser forested area. So it's a rare fossil find from an area where fossils would not have been well preserved on a regular basis. So an excellent find. And it turns out that this particular specimen, we have most of the cranium. It is crushed because of the context of the find. And like I said, it dates from 7 to 6 million years ago. It has a very small cranial capacity, about 350 cc's. We also notice it's got great big brow ridges. Right? It actually also has a pretty decent sized canine. And all those features are pretty ape-like, right? Small brain, robust facial features, larger canine. However, when you flip this specimen over, the foramen magnum is positioned anteriorly, right? Not posterior like in a chimpanzee. It's anterior or underneath the cranium. So this indicates that this fossil, 7 to 6 million years ago, was using bipedal locomotion. Now, we can't say that this species was an obligatory or habitual biped, but it was using bipedalism enough. It was adapted to bipedalism that you get that foramen magnum under the cranium. This is also a particularly useful or interesting species find because it undermines the savanna hypothesis. It undermines the idea of complete thermoregulation for a hot, dry environment, because this is a species based on climatic reconstruction that would have lived in a fairly densely forested environment. So bipedalism would be used for terrestrial locomotion, and obviously there would be the need for arboreal activity as well. Then, a little later in time, we move to East Africa, that African Rift Valley and the Tugan Hills of Kenya. And what we're primarily going to be looking at as we look along the African Rift Valley is north part of the African Rift Valley is Ethiopia. The central region is Kenya, and the southern part of the major part of the southern aspect of the Rift Valley is Tanzania. Right? So here we're looking at in the country of Kenya, close to the Tugan Hills, just south of Lake Turkana. We will come back to Lake Turkana on numerous occasions to talk about fossils from the Turkana region. But here in the Tugan Hills, they found a femur, or a partial femur, shown here in the center. The species is known as Auroran tugenensis, from about 6 million years ago. This femur is consistent with bipedalism. And what you have is a comparison of a chimpanzee femur on the far right, a human femur, modern human femur on the far left, and in between is Auroran. And you can see the similarities to a modern human with the long neck, which would have pushed the proximal end of the femur shaft lateral, pushed it out, and then naturally the shaft would angle medially coming into the knees. Whereas with the chimp femur, you have a very short neck because the femurs drop straight down from the hips. So the femur that's consistent with bipedalism, but in the hand, there's a phalanx that's been recovered, or a finger bone, and that is curved. And curved fingers are consistent with grasping hands, climbing, and arboreal behavior. Right? So here we're seeing a mix of traits associated with different behavioral patterns based on the length of the femur fragment fragments that have been found. It's estimated that Auroran tugenensis was about 3.3 feet tall. So not very big, basically about like a good-sized chimpanzee if they were to stand up on their hind limbs. So ape-like in size, ape-like hands most likely, but a femur adapted for bipedalism. Oh, there's that long neck. Now we're going to look at the sites associated with Ardipithecus, and in particular, Ardipithecus ramidus. This comes from Ethiopia, so the northern portion of the African Rift Valley. There's a number of sites in this area, and we will again come back to the Afar Depression. As you can see, on the middle Awash, Aramis, and other sites. And right now we're going to look at the middle awash area. And this is where we have fossils both from Ardipithecus cadaba and Ardipithecus ramidus. For our purposes, we're going to look at ramidus. This is the one that we have the best evidence for and is the most interesting, if I may say so. Ardipithecus ramidus dates to about 4.4 million years ago, and from Ethiopia, so from East Africa. You won't ever be asked on a quiz which country or which specific site a fossil comes from. You won't be asked specific dates. Right? But I want you to get the general chronology in your head and the general geography. Do they come from Central Africa, East Africa, or South Africa? That's going to be the focus over the next couple lectures. So that's how you want to. And then who's the earliest? Who comes next? Who comes after that? So that you have a general chronological sequence in your mind. This is Ardipithecus ramidus, nickname Artie. That's a nice nickname. Again, we have a fairly small cranial capacity. And as you can see, this is a fairly complete fossil. You have both cranial remains as well as postcranial remains. We have arm bones, hand bones, hip bones, leg bones, foot bones, right? And so from the remains, we can tell that Artie, or Ardipithecus ramidus, had about a small cranial capacity, definitely in the ape range, 300 to 350 cc's. Short, non-projecting canines, which is associated with bipedalism, and a no honing complex, so no honing of the maxillary canine and the mandibular P3, that again is associated with bipedalism. It's not a direct indicator of bipedalism, but is consistent with what we see in bipedal hominins. And then we have hips. You can see the hips, pretty short and broad as opposed to tall and long. And a femur is adapted for bipedality. So we know hips and femurs are very key for interpreting locomotor behavior. But interestingly, when we get down to the feet, where we might expect to have a big toe in line with the other toes, and short toes, and the longitudinal arch of the foot, all traits that we as modern humans have as bipedal organisms, we see that instead there is a divergent first toe in the foot. Divergent first toe in the foot. So this is really remarkable because prior to this, it was assumed that bowl-shaped pelvis, medially angled femur, platform foot, which means first toe in line with the other toes, and the longitudinal arch, that sort of heel strike toe off way that we walk, was all basically come as a package. But Ardipithecus ramidus proves that is not how evolution occurred. That is not how evolution occurred, that we have hips and legs adapted for bipedalism, but the feet are still grasping feet. Yes? If it would help for walking balance, no. Because what it does is it makes the foot very flat, and our feet are designed for balance with our toes all in line. So it sort of spreads your weight out, and it makes for a much more like trying to walk with flippers almost, like swim flippers, because of the way that it spreads your foot out. So, but this means that Ardipithecus ramidus, and this is an artist's reconstruction, right? would have basically had hips and legs for bipedalism and been able to walk fairly efficiently, not like you or I, or not even like the later Australopithecines, but would have been able to do it more efficiently than like a modern chimpanzee or bonobo or gorilla. Right? But they have that divergent first digit and long toe bones, a grasping foot. So further proof for both terrestrial adaptation using bipedalism on the ground, as well as a need to be able to utilize tree resources or arboreal resources. Plus, we also got to remember that evolution never happens in a uniform, lineal fashion. Right? We don't get, well, I'm going to be a biped now, so my hips need to be this way, my legs need to be this way, my feet need to be this way. Evolution happens in a patchwork fashion. So it's clear that some of the first elements of the skeleton to adapt to a bipedalism are the hips and the legs, because we've seen that with Auroran and with Ardipithecus. And then after that, we'll start to see changes in the feet as well. And this probably associated with changes in climate, changes in adaptation through time. Because as we get closer and closer to the present, we are continuing to see drying and retraction of the tropical forests on the African continent. So Ardipithecus ramidus, or Ardi, is rather interesting because he threw a lot of ideas about how the evolution of bipedalism occurred into a tailspin. He confounds a lot of the earlier interpretations because he's obviously living in a more forested environment and using arboreal locomotion far more frequently than was expected. So, consistent with certain aspects of our ideas about the evolution of bipedalism, but not all, and that is science. We've taken the new information, the new data, the new finds, and we revise our hypotheses, and we reevaluate them against the evidence. Right? Interestingly, you see I have a reconstruction there. The black and white skull is Artie's skull compared to a chimp skull. Does it look like a chimp skull or like our skulls? It's an awful lot like a chimp skull, doesn't it? Small cranial capacity, big brow ridges. We do have a reduction in the canine. It's not a projecting canine. Don't have that CP3 honing complex, but in many ways, cranially, very ape-like, except for that canine. Whereas the hips and legs are designed for, or adapted for bipedalism, whereas the hands and feet, and even the arms, the very long arms, are adapted for arboreal activity. Right? So these earliest hominins, contrary to ideas about adaptation to a savanna lifestyle or sort of a provisioning hypothesis where you would have gone out and collected animals and other things to bring back to a home base, more likely we get adaptation to this forested, wooded settings where food resources would have been both on the ground and in the trees, and the ability to efficiently access both terrestrial foods as well as arboreal foods, moving from forested area to forested area would have been highly beneficial. So that would have been the advantageous phenotype. So we see, in general, ape-like forms, small brains, small bodies, very ape-like, Long arms with long curved fingers. So arms adapted for suspensory behavior and grasping in the trees. And a divergent first digit in the foot with curved toes. We get that from Ardipithecus ramidus. Right? However, we also have a suite of traits that are consistent with verging on habitual bipedalism. Not quite, but getting there. This patchwork of evolution. A femur and pelvis adapted for bipedalism. And this is not just bipedalism like a chimp or a gorilla or an orang who can stand up and walk for a little bit. They can waddle for a little bit. But because of the energetic expense of contracting those gluteal muscles and keeping the trunk upright, they can only do it for so long. These are hips designed for keeping the trunk upright for extended periods of time. A femur adapted for keeping the center of gravity underneath the body, not out like you would in a quadruped. A foramen magnum underneath the cranial vault. And that reduced CP3 honing complex or lack of the CP3 honing complex, which again is associated with the evolution of bipedalism. Right. So these very earliest hominins are this true patchwork, this mosaic of traits. So now we're going to look at the early Australopithecines. With the early Australopithecines, particularly the two species that we're going to look at here, Australopithecus apharensis and Australopithecus africanus. Here we have true habitual or obligatory bipedalism. We're going to see the full suite of traits that we expect to see in bipedal hominids. Right? Hominids. So, Australopithecus afarensis is from East Africa. We're going to have Australopithecus afarensis specimens or sites all throughout the African Rift Valley. So this was a widespread species that also existed for about, current dates, about 600,000 years on the landscape. Australopithecus africanus is from South Africa. It's a little bit later than Apharensis, and have evidence for it being present for about 1 million years. So the key here is Australopithecus apharensis is from East Africa. Australopithecus africanus is from South Africa. Apharensis is where we're going to see first true complete suite of bipedal locomotor adaptations, and then we will also see similar traits in Africanus. All right, so again, just re-emphasizing that for Apharensis, we're going to be looking at sites as far north as Ethiopia. We're going to be looking at sites in Kenya, as well as sites in Tanzania. South Africa, there are a number of cave sites where we get Africanus fossils. So Apharensis, like I said, several locations in East Africa. We'll come back to each. One of the most famous of the Australopithecus apharensis fossils is Lucy, known as AL288-1. That's her scientific name. AL refers to the Afar locality. That is the site that she comes from in the Hadar region. The Afar locality, AL, hence the name Australopithecus apharensis. Right? So she comes from East Africa. This particular fossil dates to about 3 million years ago. and was located in 1974 by Dr. Don Johansen. And as you can see, this is a complete fossil laid out, all the remains of Lucy, or AL288, on the far right. And there's quite a bit of the postcranial skeleton present. They were working these very dry, desert-like areas, and some of her bones were eroding out of the sediments, and they went set to work, and soon they had recovered quite a bit of her skeleton. In particular, her hip bone, or os coxa, and femur. And it quickly became apparent that evening back at camp as they were cleaning her bones, or the fossilized bones, that this was a short, broad os coxa, or hip bone. This was consistent with bipedalism. So they're back at camp at night. It's 1974. They're playing music. The Beatles song, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, was on. And they were like, holy smokes, y'all. This is some of the earliest evidence of bipedalism. This is, back at that time, everybody was looking for the missing link. Like, we've got it, we've got it. They got really excited. And they named her Lucy after the Beatles song, which I don't think is about fossils or anything related to fossils. Although, maybe, all right, I'm going to leave it there. This was a very, very famous fossil, still is. It was at the time the earliest fossil, most complete fossil from this early time period. And we have that clear evidence from the pelvis and the femur of bipedalism. So I said, she's from about 3 million years ago. Where do we get these times from? And these dates. And I just want to kind of give you an idea of these different sediments, particularly in the Hadar region of Ethiopia. There's layers of sediment, and then there are layers of ash. So many of these dates come from the layers of ash, because those can be directly dated using potassium argon radiometric dating. Directly dated. And so with Lucy, AL288, she's right above a 3.18 million year ash layer. So you can estimate her age based on that, but below a 2.95 million year old ash layer. So by dating those layers within the sediment, you come up with dates. And you'll notice that we have fossils as far down as the lower AL417 and up as close as almost to the 2.95. Right? So you have a range. You see that there is a large male scale AL444 right up there close to the 2.95 ash layer. That is one of the specimens you have in lab to look at this week. And also you have Lucy AL288 that you're looking in lab. So how do we know Lucy was bipedal? Well, we can take a look at that pelvis. We have a short, broad ilium that would be very similar to yours or I's, not identical. Don't mean that, but it's very similar to your eye. We have a femur with a long neck, so you get the lateral projection of the proximal femur and medial angulation of the shaft down to the knee to create the valgus knee. So you have the medial angulation, the valgus angle at the knee, all adaptations for bipedalism. One of the things we don't have from Lucy is foot bones. We don't really have foot bones from Lucy. But we know we've got an efficient, potentially obligatory biped based on the hip, the pelvis, and the femur. And this is on the far right there is a reconstruction of a complete Lucy skeleton, and you can see the bones that are present from the arms and the hand indicate very long arms, long curved fingers, but a very bowl-shaped pelvis, and femoral femurs adapted for bipedalism. So we're going to here look at Lucy